the most realistic person in the room is often the one who never moves. The person who seems slightly delusional may be the only one willing to act before certainty gives permission. You can see every obstacle clearly, calculate every risk correctly, and still remain trapped at the starting line. It isn't realism that keeps you stuck. It's using realism as a shield against the exposure of trying. Here's the truth underneath it. Early progress rarely begins with proof. It begins with a measured belief that makes action possible before the evidence arrives. Machiavelli recognized that fortune tends to yield more readily to boldness than to hesitation, because bold action creates conditions that waiting can never produce. The advantage is not fantasy. It is the willingness to treat an unproven possibility as worthy of a first move. By the end, you will know how to separate useful overbelief from reckless denial. You will see when your realism is protecting your judgment and when it is quietly protecting your fear. Most importantly, you will learn how to back yourself without needing to invent evidence or ignore reality. Before we go further, write this in the comments. I move before proof arrives. This isn't for the algorithm. It is a reminder that your first advantage may appear before anyone else can verify it. Now, let's begin. The first sign is that you stop demanding emotional certainty before taking a rational step. Strict realists often confuse two different questions. Is this guaranteed to work? And is this worth testing? The first question can paralyze you because almost nothing meaningful is guaranteed at the beginning. The second question gives you a path. It asks whether the downside is survivable, whether the upside matters, and whether one deliberate move can create information that thinking alone cannot provide. This is the mechanism behind useful overbelief. Your mind wants evidence before commitment because evidence feels like protection. But in unfamiliar territory, evidence is often produced by commitment. You do not discover every fact and then act. You act carefully, and the consequences reveal facts that were invisible from a distance. There is a difference between uncertainty that requires investigation and uncertainty that merely demands surrender. The first tells you to narrow the experiment. The second tells you to remain still until the entire future becomes harmless. That future never arrives. Every meaningful attempt retains some exposure. So the question is not how to eliminate uncertainty, but how to give it a safe boundary. Watch the language you use when you delay. I need to know more. The timing is not right. Someone more qualified should do this. Sometimes those statements are accurate, but what happens when they appear every time the next step could expose your ability to judgment? It isn't always prudence. It may be fear wearing the clothes of prudence. Most people wait for confidence to arrive as a feeling. The few who move forward treat confidence as a result of contact with reality. They make a small bet, observe what happens, and adjust without turning the first attempt into a verdict on their identity. A cautious first move is not a betrayal of realism. It is realism put to work. If your plan survives only while it remains private, it is not yet a plan you can trust. Give it a small surface of contact with the world, then let the response improve it. Number 2. You separate a dangerous fantasy from a useful assumption. The slightly delusional person who wins is not necessarily the person who believes every thought. That is denial. Denial refuses correction, dismisses consequences, and treats desire as proof. Useful overbelief does something more disciplined. It temporarily assumes that a worthwhile outcome is possible, so you can behave in a way that gives it a chance to become real. The mechanism is simple. Your behavior follows the future you consider available. If you believe an outcome is impossible, you will not gather the skills, contacts, repetitions, or patience required to reach it. Then the lack of results appears to confirm the original belief. The prediction creates the behavior that fulfills it. A useful assumption breaks that loop. It says, this may work, and the only honest way to find out is to run a controlled test. Not, this must work. Not, failure cannot happen. Only, this deserves movement before certainty. Notice the discipline hidden inside that assumption. It has a time limit, a measurable action, and a condition under which the method must change. Fantasy asks reality to obey the story. A useful assumption asks reality to answer the question. One protects an image, the other improves a decision. What would your next month look like if you treated your goal as a hypothesis instead of a prophecy? What evidence could you create without risking your health, your integrity, or your entire future? Could you make the call, publish the draft, submit the proposal, or practice the skill while remaining open to what the response teaches you? Machiavelli's insight about boldness was never a permission slip for stupidity. Boldness matters because fortune is partly shaped by the people willing to enter the uncertain space where outcomes are still being formed. But boldness without judgment is just noise. The useful version carries a map of risks, an exit point, and a willingness to update. It isn't belief versus reality. It is belief used to enter reality. The strict realist asks for proof before building capacity. The strategic believer builds enough capacity to generate proof. You do not need to call a possibility certain. You need to give it enough structure to be tested, enough effort to be judged, and enough humility to be revised. Number 3, you recognize that realism can become a social agreement to remain ordinary. A room full of cautious people can make limitations sound like wisdom. One person names the obstacles, another adds a practical concern. A third explains why the timing is unfavorable. Soon, nobody is discussing whether the idea can be tested. They are rewarding one another for refusing to be embarrassed by trying. The mechanism is social protection. If everyone stays skeptical, no one has to stand alone with an unproven ambition. Agreement creates relief. It also creates stagnation. The group feels intelligent because it has identified what might go wrong, while quietly avoiding the more difficult question, what might remain impossible, because nobody was willing to begin. There is a hidden exchange in that kind of room. You trade the discomfort of a visible attempt for the comfort of shared limitation. Nobody has to admit that the obstacle may be smaller than the fear surrounding it. Nobody has to discover that the person labeled unrealistic was simply willing to collect evidence in public. Pay attention to moments when your realism becomes performative. Do you explain the weakness of every opportunity before investigating it? Do you feel a private sense of superiority when others take a chance? Do you call someone naive because their confidence forces you to confront your own unused ability? This does not mean every confident person sees clearly. Some people are simply loud. But why assume the loud person is the only one being irrational? A person who believes every risk is a reason to withdraw is also making a judgment, and that judgment may be just as distorted. Machiavelli repeatedly favored the person who could seize an opening over the person who merely described it. An opening does not remain open because your analysis is impressive. Conditions shift, other people enter. The opportunity becomes expensive, crowded, or irrelevant. Fortune often rewards timing before it rewards perfection. Most people want permission from the group before moving. The few who create change are often willing to be temporarily misunderstood without turning that misunderstanding into a personal war. You do not need to announce your vision to everyone. You need to know whether your caution is protecting a sound decision or protecting your reputation. If the only thing at stake is the possibility of looking inexperienced, then the price of waiting may be higher than the price of trying. Ask what the group gains by keeping the standard low. Does your hesitation make someone else feel safer, more important, or less accountable for their own unfinished plans? You do not need to accuse them. You only need to notice the incentive. Once you saw the social reward attached to hesitation, it becomes harder to mistake that reward for truth. The room may call you unrealistic before it calls you successful. That is not proof that you are right. It is proof that early movement is difficult to judge from the outside. Number 4, you begin acting from a chosen identity before the world confirms it. A person does not become capable only after receiving a title, an audience, or a visible result. Those things often arrive after repeated behavior has already established the capability. The problem is that many people wait for the external label before permitting the internal standard. The mechanism is identity protection. You behave in ways that preserve the current description of yourself. If you see yourself as someone who is not ready, every challenge becomes evidence for delay. If you see yourself as a person who is learning to operate at a higher level, difficulty becomes part of the role rather than a disqualification from it. This is not pretending to possess skills you do not have. It is choosing the standard you will practice before anyone is obligated to recognize it. A person can act like a serious writer before being published, like a disciplined leader before being published, like a reliable professional before receiving applause. The behavior comes first. The reputation follows slowly. Ask yourself, what would this task look like if it were already part of who you are? Would you prepare differently? Would you recover faster from a poor attempt? Would you stop negotiating with the habit every morning? And what would disappear if you stopped waiting for permission to behave according to that standard? Perhaps the dramatic announcement would disappear. Perhaps the excuse about needing a new identity would disappear. What remains is less glamorous but more powerful, a repeated action performed without an audience. Watch for the quiet sentence, "That is just not the kind of person you are." Sometimes it is self-knowledge. Often it is an old identity defending its territory. The mind prefers a familiar limitation to an unfamiliar responsibility. You stop waiting to feel like the person. You stop asking whether the role has been granted. You stop treating the first imperfect performance as evidence that you were never meant to perform it. That is the identity shift. Not a costume, but a standard. Machiavelli understood that authority is strengthened when conduct makes a claim before others have fully agreed with it. The person who consistently behaves with steadiness teaches the environment how to respond. This does not mean demanding respect. It means giving people a pattern they can recognize. You do not need to lie about where you are. You need to stop using where you are as an excuse to remain there. Let the standard lead, let the skill catch up, and let recognition arrive on its own schedule. Number 5. You use small bets to turn conviction into evidence. This is where strategic confidence separates itself from fantasy. Fantasy makes a large emotional claim and then resists measurement. Strategic confidence chooses an action small enough to survive, clear enough to evaluate, and meaningful enough to produce movement. The mechanism is feedback. When a goal remains abstract, your mind can inflate both hope and fear. You imagine total success or total humiliation because nothing concrete has interrupted the story. A small bet forces contact with actual conditions. It tells you what the market, the audience, the skill, or the situation is really asking from you. A good small bet has 3 features. It has a defined cost, a visible signal, and a decision point. You know what you are risking. You know what response matters. You know when to continue, revise, or stop. That structure prevents confidence from becoming an excuse to ignore consequences. Suppose you believe you could build a new service. You do not need to abandon everything and declare victory. You might speak with several people who have the problem, create a basic version, invite direct criticism, and see whether anyone returns for a second conversation. The belief supplies the courage to test. The test supplies the correction. What can you risk that would teach you something valuable, even if the result is disappointing? What is the smallest public action that would make hiding more difficult? Where could you replace another week of private analysis with one piece of observable feedback? It isn't bet everything on yourself. It is bet enough on yourself to obtain information. The strict realist often demands a complete plan because a complete plan appears to remove vulnerability. But a plan built without contact is only a polished guess. You need direction, not an imaginary guarantee. Machiavelli's view of fortune leaves room for preparation, but preparation becomes power only when it meets an opening. The person who waits until every variable is known will discover that the variables have moved. The person who acts with a bounded risk can learn while the situation is still alive. A failed small bet is data. A protected dream is only a story. And when the test disproves your first assumption, you do not call yourself a fraud. You refine the assumption. Confidence that can survive correction is stronger than confidence that requires applause. Do not ask whether the first test proves that you are destined for the outcome. Ask what it reveals about the next test. That question keeps the lesson larger than the result. It also keeps one disappointing response from becoming a permanent sentence about your ability. Number 6. You protect your momentum from the voices that profit from your hesitation. Not every critic is an enemy. Some criticism prevents expensive mistakes. The important distinction is whether the person is examining your plan or attempting to reduce your willingness to act. One improves the move, the other makes movement itself feel shameful. The mechanism is emotional contagion. Doubt spreads easily because it asks less of the speaker than courage does. Someone can list 10 reasons your attempt may fail in a minute. That does not mean they have considered the cost of never testing it. Their certainty may come from experience, or it may come from a need to keep the world predictable. Listen for the pattern. Do they ask useful questions? Do they identify a specific weakness and suggest a repair? Or do they use labels such as childish, unrealistic, arrogant, or lucky whenever you refuse their preferred limits? Watch your body after certain conversations. Do you leave with clearer decisions or with a vague desire to apologize for having an ambition? Do you feel challenged to improve or trained to shrink? A useful critic leaves you with a sharper map. A controlling critic leaves you with a smaller sense of permission. The words may sound similar on the surface, but the effect is different. One increases your ability to choose. The other makes their approval feel like the price of movement. You should not build a life around proving doubters wrong. That still makes them the center of your decisions. Instead, learn to filter. Take the information. Leave the emotional verdict. The few who maintain momentum are not immune to doubt. They are selective about which doubt receives authority. They understand that a person can be sincere and still be wrong about your ceiling. Machiavelli warned in essence that dependence weakens judgment. If your willingness to move depends entirely on approval, anyone who withdraws approval gains control over your direction. The answer is not isolation. It is an inner standard strong enough to hear disagreement without surrendering the decision. Not every warning deserves obedience. Not every cheer deserves belief. Your task is to test both against reality. You can remain teachable without becoming movable. Hear the concern, identify the evidence, and decide what deserves a response. Your momentum should be guided by facts, not rented out to whoever speaks with the most confidence. Number 7. You become the person who can act with conviction and still remain answerable to facts. This is the final distinction. The winner is not the person who feels certain all the time. The winner is the person who can create enough certainty to move, then remain flexible enough to change course. That combination is rare because it requires two qualities the ego dislikes holding together: self-trust and self-correction. The mechanism is disciplined agency. You decide before the outcome is known, but you do not confuse the decision with a sacred identity. You commit to the experiment, not to an interpretation of yourself. You can say, "This is worth pursuing," and later say, "The evidence has changed the route," without experiencing revision as humiliation. What happens when your confidence is challenged? Do you become defensive because the dream has become inseparable from your pride? Or can you protect the deeper aim while discarding the weak method? A decision is not a prophecy. It is a temporary arrangement between your current knowledge and your next action. When new information arrives, changing the arrangement is not betrayal. It is evidence that the decision was connected to reality in the first place. This is where useful overbelief becomes vision. Vision does not claim that obstacles are imaginary. It claims that obstacles are not the whole description of the future. It sees conditions clearly and still identifies a possible opening. It does not wait for the world to become favorable. It looks for the action that can make the world less closed. You act before proof arrives, but you keep your eyes open after you act. You trust yourself, but you do not exempt yourself from consequences. You move boldly, but you do not make recklessness a personality. That is not ordinary confidence. It is composure under uncertainty. Machiavelli's lesson about boldness points toward a deeper identity. Fortune is more responsive to the person who enters the contest than to the person who studies it forever. Once you understand that, you stop asking whether you are delusional for seeing a possibility early. You ask whether your belief is producing disciplined action, useful feedback, and greater capacity. The world may call it delusion while the evidence is still forming. Your responsibility is not to win that argument. It is to build something real enough that the argument no longer matters. Remember what you saw today. Realism becomes useful when it leads to a test, not when it becomes a hiding place. Useful overbelief treats possibility as a reason to investigate, not as proof of guaranteed success. Social skepticism can protect a group from embarrassment while keeping everyone stationary. Identity is built through standards practiced before recognition arrives. Small bets turn conviction into evidence without demanding reckless sacrifice. Criticism should sharpen your judgment, not govern your courage. And the final advantage is the ability to move with conviction while remaining answerable to facts. The goal is not to become reckless or suspicious. It is to become clear. This is about recognizing fear disguised as realism when it is used on you, not using false confidence on anyone. Stay aware, stay adjustable, and let your belief make you more capable rather than less honest. You do not need proof that the entire path will work. You need enough clarity to take the next intelligent step. Remember the words you wrote at the beginning, "I move before proof arrives." Let them remind you that an unproven possibility can still deserve a disciplined first step. And while you are there writing it, the pinned comment holds Virtue Pyrals, the Machiavelli doctrine, the complete system for forging a mind no one can read or move, with Iron for strengthening your own judgment and Crown for recognizing the forces shaping the people around you. If this sharpens something in you, subscribe. The next lesson goes deeper. The first step is often invisible, but it leaves footprints reality cannot erase.